President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I want to discuss an amendment that I'm not sure when it will be offered. I understand it will be offered, that I think is very significant. Now, first of all, let's keep in mind what this is all about. The NDAA is the National Defense Authorization Act. It's one that you know is going to pass. I mean, it's passed for 55 consecutive years. I mean, if something happened that didn't pass, the kids wouldn't get hazard pay, they wouldn't get flight pay. It'd be really traumatic if that happened. But it's not going to happen. It's going to pass. It's the most important bill, I believe, that we pass every year. And as I say, we've passed it now for 55 consecutive years, and we'll pass it. We'll pass this one. And it's important that we do it right away. Sometimes it gets stalled until later in the year. But if it isn't done by the end of December, that's when everything falls apart. And so we just don't need to do that. And I believe that we have the momentum to go ahead and get it done. Now, we are facing a threat. I've stood at this podium so many times now talking about how I look back wistfully at the days of the Cold War, when you had two superpowers. We knew what they had. They knew what we had. Mutual assured destruction meant something. But now it's totally different. We hear a lot about the two biggest threats facing us right now would be North Korea and Iran. You know, I stand on the side that it's North Korea, because North Korea is run by someone with a questionable mentality, and they are developing. I've watched them over the years develop the capabilities that they now have, and I certainly agree that Iran also is a serious threat. But the fact that our armed forces are now in a condition that they have not in a long time. I chair the committee called the Readiness Subcommittee in the Senate, and we had the vice chairs testifying before us not too long ago. They testified that we are in worse shape now than we were during the hollow force of the 1970s. It was right after the Carter administration. Many of us remember that. And I certainly do. Our armed forces are smaller than in the days of the hollow force in the 1970s, and readiness in the form of personnel, training, and equipment have been degraded, I think, to a breaking point. All the while, we have witnessed an uptick in the training and operational accidents across the armed forces. While the risks posed by the readiness crisis are significant, Congress is already taking steps to correct the shortfalls. Every amendment considered for the NDAA should focus on increasing readiness across our services. We owe it to our troops and our nation. Nothing short is acceptable. And that's why it was disappointing and dangerous that we are considering an amendment that would authorize a base alignment and closure round, better known to all of us as a BRAC round. We've had 5 BRAC rounds since 1989. I'm familiar with all of them. I, along with many of the colleagues in the Senate Armed Services Committee, successfully have a provision there that would include a prohibition against a BRAC round. Now, I think it's pretty obvious. Everyone knows what the threat is out there. At least those on the Armed Services Committee do. But they also know that any BRAC round that you do is going to have the effect of costing a lot of money that should be spent on readiness. And that money is because no matter what a base alignment and a closure is, a BRAC is, the amount of money that is, when you first start it, it's going to be very expensive. Unfortunately, an amendment is pending that would enable a new BRAC round in 2019 and at the same time remove, and this is critical, remove the nonpartisan commission that allows both local defense communities and Congress input into the BRAC process. Now, I'll tell you what, that's important. I remember because that was shortly after I was first elected. Prior to 1989, the Defense Department was they were the ones that made the decisions as to what's going to happen to our various installations around America. And it was very, very political. People would go and there are rumors, or there's some stories that they would agree for certain considerations to allow someone to continue to operate when they really shouldn't be operating. Well, the Pentagon claims that a BRAC round would save money and would allow the military to invest that money into critical readiness shortfalls. And it's just not true. And before the most recent BRAC round in 2005, we heard these same arguments from the Pentagon, that the BRAC would somehow save money and would allow military to increase efficiency. With 22 major base closings and 33 realignments, that's what happened in 2005. The round was depicted as to save, they were supposed to save over a 20-year period $35 billion with costs of $21 billion. The reality is far different. The 2005 BRAC round cost taxpayers roughly $35 billion and is only expected to save a $9.9 billion over the next 20 years. Now, the other day I went back and looked up just to see what the GAO said about that. Now, keep in mind, it was a 2005 BRAC round, but it was the GAO study was actually in 2011, saying, well, we know what we said at that time. Let's see how they performed. So let me go ahead and read to you. This is right out of their report. It says, the one-time implementation costs, now that's the cost of putting together a BRAC round, the one-time cost grew from $21 billion originally estimated by the BRAC Commission in 2005 to be $35 billion. In other words, they said it was going to cost $21 billion, and it ended up costing $35 billion. That's an increase of 67%. I mean, that's just, and it's been that way with the other rounds too. Here's, and looking at their analysis of the value, and it's very important we understand what they're saying here. They said, the GAO, the 20-year net present value DOD, Department of Defense, can expect by implementing the 2005 BRAC recommendations has decreased by 72%. In other words, they're 72% off as to what great savings we're going to have in the future by making these closures. The 20-year, they went on to say, the 20-year net present value, that is the present value of future savings minus the present value of upfront investment costs of $35.6 billion, estimated by the Commission in 2005 for this BRAC round, has decreased by 72%. I mean, it cannot be more specific than that. And this is the consistent pattern that we have. So clearly, those base closure rounds cost the American taxpayers an exorbitant amount of money up front and take years to recoup their initial investment, if they ever do. In this case, they haven't. And with the history of previous inconsistencies between expected and actual costs, there's no certainty that any proposed base closures or realignments would be economically viable now or any time in the future. Now, we're in a point of uncertainty that makes it irresponsible to expend billions of dollars downsizing our armed forces when we are currently facing some of the most volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous military threats that America has ever seen. Readiness can't wait, and our enemies around the world won't. We must also consider the possibility that we'll soon require a capacity that is presently considered excess if the current military threats materialize in a manner that would encourage expansion of our armed services. I think that just stands to reason. You know, we know the threats are out there, and we know that the problems are more severe than they've ever been in the history of this country. And so maybe the current size of our forces will not be adequate. Well, it's a lot cheaper to go ahead and keep something that's already there than it is to tear down something and then start something all over again. So anyway, in the early years, everybody knows the certainty is there that it will cost money in the early years. The high cost of BRAC round would divert resources away from addressing immediate, tangible threats. Just last week, North Korea tested what is believed to be a hydrogen bomb, its most powerful nuclear weapon tested to date, estimated at nearly 7 times as powerful as the bomb detonated in Hiroshima. This came on the heels of North Korea's first successfully tested, more powerful and far-ranging intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM. We're familiar with that. tests that began over the summer. Now, if fired on a trajectory, experts believe the ICBMs tested could have reached the United States of America. You know, I can remember talking about this with our intelligence department years ago, and at that time we were saying, you know, they could finally develop a bomb and a delivery system that could reach the United States of America. Well, that may be here today. If not, it's imminent. The BRAC round now would also shortchange a response to immediate readiness needs. Over the last 90 days, we've witnessed a spike in accidents across the military services, especially in the form in the Navy and some of the aviation mishaps. While these accidents are still under investigation to determine the cause, it's not hard to correlate them with the readiness decline. Our forces are smaller than the days of the Hollow Force in the 1970s. Our equipment is aging. Our base infrastructure requires critical maintenance and upgrades. Our Air Force is short 1,500 pilots. 1,300 of those are fighter pilots. Only 50% of the Air Force squadrons are trained and ready to conduct their assigned missions. The Navy is the smallest and the least ready it's been in years, and currently can only meet about 40% of the demand from regional combat commanders. Now, we're talking about the commanders in the field who make that assessment. We can only carry out less than 40% of that. More than half the Navy aircraft are grounded because they're waiting maintenance or lack of necessary parts. The Marine Corps, they use F-18s. Their F-18s, known as the Hornets, 62% of them are broken. And they can't, and so we don't have that capacity. The Army has said that about a third of their brigade combat teams, 1/4 of their current of their combat aviation brigades, and 1/2 of their division headquarters are currently ready. So, worry about the Army readiness. The guy that then was the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Alley, he said, and this is a quote, and you got to listen to this. He said, "When it comes down to it, we will be too late to need. Our soldiers will arrive too late. Our soldiers will require too much time to close the manning, training, and equipment gap. The end result is excessive casualties to civilians and to our forces who are already forward stationed." We're talking about lives. We're talking about American lives. And that's a sobering assessment, especially when considering the gravity of the threats we face around the world, including, of course, the Korean Peninsula. The NDAA's first priority has got to be to rebuild our forces and to improve its readiness. And that's what we're in the process of doing right now, and we need to get it done. A BRAC round would divert vast resources away from this end, improving readiness, from savings that we would not see for decades to come, if we ever did. Now, we're growing, not shrinking. Now is not the time for a BRAC round. I hope my colleagues in the Senate will join me in rejecting this amendment. However well-intentioned, it's not time for a short-sighted BRAC round. And again, I'll just repeat one more time. There are still members out there, because I've talked to them, senators, who are saying that they really believe that they've been told that somehow we're going to have more money for readiness if we have a BRAC round. It's just exactly the opposite. And this is, you know, again, straight from the GAO. They made the analysis of the 2005 BRAC round, and they said that the 20-year net present value DOD can expect by implementing the 2005 BRAC recommendation has decreased by 72%. So it always costs a lot more and saves much less in the long run. With that, I would encourage my colleagues to reject this amendment if this amendment is indeed offered, and yield the floor, suggest the